It began as just another ordinary evening in a quiet neighborhood, but in a matter of seconds everything changed. The sound of shouting cut through the air, and then a single shot shattered the silence, leaving a husband bleeding on his own doorstep. Neighbors froze in disbelief, as the very person meant to uphold order in the community had crossed a line no one ever imagined. This was not about late fees or lawn disputes anymore. It was about life and death, and the question that haunts everyone is simple. How did a petty HOA dispute spiral into such violence, and what came next when the police arrived? Jake and Maria had chosen their home for its quiet charm, a modest house with a wide front porch, where evenings were spent watching the sun sink. Behind the rows of manicured lawns, it was the kind of neighborhood where children rode, bikes until dusk, and neighbors waved as they passed. The promise of stability and safety had drawn them there, a chance to raise their 2 children without the chaos of city life. For a while it seemed like they had found exactly what they were searching for, a peaceful corner of suburbia where everyone minded their own business. The community was overseen by the Homeowners Association, a body that was supposed to protect property values and maintain order. On paper, it sounded simple enough, but the reality was far different. Rules seemed endless, from the color of a front door to the height of a fence. Nothing escaped their scrutiny. Jake was a man of patience. He believed in compromise and keeping the peace. Maria was softer in demeanor, but equally protective of her family's comfort. Neither of them could have imagined how quickly their ordinary lives would be disrupted. At first the notices seemed trivial, a warning about a lawn that had grown too tall during a week of rain, a reminder about a car parked too close to the curb, things they brushed aside with mild frustration. But beneath these warnings lingered a tone of control, an edge that suggested the HOA was less concerned with order and more intent on power. Behind every letter was a name, a woman whose presence cast a shadow over the neighborhood. She was known for her sharp voice at meetings and her relentless pursuit of anyone who dared to step outside the rules. Life for Jake and Maria carried on with a thin layer of tension, an unspoken awareness that they were being watched. The children still played in the yard, and dinners were shared at the table. Yet every trip to the mailbox carried the possibility of another notice, another demand, another reminder that peace in this neighborhood was conditional. What they did not know was that these small intrusions were only the beginning, that what seemed like petty inconveniences would soon evolve into a conflict that tested not only their patience, but their very safety. A storm was forming quietly behind the smiles and manicured hedges, waiting for the moment to break. The first signs of real trouble came in the form of an official-looking envelope tucked neatly into Jake and Maria's mailbox, the kind of letter that immediately carried weight just by the stamp and seal. Printed at the top, Jake unfolded it at the kitchen table while Maria set dinner on the plates. It was a violation notice. The HOA claimed the family's mailbox was the wrong shade of grey, not the approved version listed in the bylaws. Jake let out a frustrated sigh. He had painted it only 6 months earlier, following the same colour guide the association had provided. Still, the paper warned of a $50 fine if the issue was not corrected. Within 10 days, Maria shook her head in disbelief. It was the first time they felt the sting of being targeted. Though they tried to dismiss it as a mistake, the beginning of something far larger had already taken root. Over the weeks, the letters kept coming, each one more absurd than the last. One accused them of leaving their garbage, cans visible for an hour too long on collection day. Another insisted their backyard fence was 2 inches higher than the community standard. Jake began to feel a tightness in his chest every time he walked to the mailbox, a sense that his family was under constant surveillance. Maria tried to reassure him, telling him it was all just paperwork and bluster. But in her heart she felt the same unease. It was no longer about maintaining order. It was about control. and the person behind it was making that very clear. Her name was Karen, the self-appointed enforcer of the HOA. She carried herself with a stern authority and prided herself on noticing every supposed infraction. Neighbors whispered about her at block parties, about the way she stormed down sidewalks with a clipboard in hand, how she showed up uninvited to count how many guests someone had in their driveway. Karen thrived on confrontation, and Jake and Maria quickly realized they had become her newest obsession. The notices were signed off by the board, but it was Karen who pushed them. Karen who insisted on escalating even the smallest issue. Soon the fines piled up. Hundreds of dollars demanded for what felt like fabricated reasons. Jake contested them at a hearing, sitting in a room where board members nodded politely while Karen sat in the corner with arms crossed, her eyes fixed on him like a predator watching prey. He laid out photographs proving the fence met standards, receipts for paint, explanations for the supposed violations, but his words fell into silence. The board thanked him and promised to review. Days later, another letter arrived. The fines were upheld, no explanation given, only a new total higher than before. The weight of it pressed down on their family. Maria cut corners at the grocery store to save money. Jake took on extra shifts at work, all while feeling like they were fighting a battle they could never win. Neighbors sympathized in private, whispering that they too had been targeted, but none dared to speak openly. They had seen what happened when someone stood up to Karen. Lawns marked with bright orange violation stickers, cars mysteriously ticketed. In one case, a family forced to move after months of harassment. Fear kept everyone compliant, and Karen knew it. The breaking point came one Saturday morning when Jake stepped outside to mow the lawn, only to find Karen standing at the edge of his driveway with her phone out, snapping photos of his property. He walked over calmly, asking what she was doing. She raised her voice loud enough for the nearby houses to hear, accusing him of breaking another rule, grass height again, claiming it was over the limit by an inch. Jake tried to explain that he was about to mow it, but Karen only smiled coldly and said the fine had already been filed. Neighbors peeked from behind curtains, watching, none willing to intervene. The humiliation burned in Jake's chest. This was no longer about grass. It was about dominance. The harassment escalated further. Anonymous complaints filed against their family for noise, for alleged damage to shared property, even for their children riding bikes too close to the street. Each notice carried the threat of fines and legal action. Jake spent late nights at the kitchen table with stacks of paperwork. Maria sat across from him, silent tears sliding down her cheeks as she watched. Her husband's shoulders slump under the pressure. Their home, once a sanctuary, now felt like a prison under surveillance, every sound and every movement scrutinized. One evening, returning home from work, Jake found a bright orange sticker slapped across their front door. It declared their property in violation and warned of further penalties. He tore it down with shaking hands. The humiliation of seeing neighbors glance at it was unbearable. Maria tried to console him, but the damage was done. They were being publicly shamed. Karen had crossed into new territory, turning their private struggle into a community spectacle. The couple began to document everything. Photographs, time-stamped videos, copies of every letter. Jake knew they would need proof if they were ever going to fight back. But the more he resisted, the bolder Karen became. She started parking her car near their driveway, sitting there for hours as if daring them to step out of line. Maria's heart raced every time she saw that vehicle. Her children asked why the lady kept staring at their house, and she had no comforting answer to give. Then came the most outrageous notice yet. A letter claiming the family owed thousands in unpaid fines and threatening foreclosure on their home. Jake read it twice, unable to believe the words on the page. They were threatening to take the very roof from over his children's heads. Fury surged through him. He knew they had been set up. The numbers inflated. the so-called violations manufactured. Yet the board stood behind the threat. Backed by Karen's relentless crusade, the walls seemed to close in tighter with each passing day, their options shrinking. At night, Jake lay awake, listening to every creak and rustle outside. Convinced Karen was watching, waiting, Maria whispered fears about safety, not just financial ruin, but what might happen if Karen's aggression kept escalating. They had seen her temper, her willingness to scream in public, her obsessive presence around their home. What if she pushed further? What if she tried to make a point in a way that went beyond paper and fines? The air in the neighborhood grew heavy with tension. Every glance from a neighbor felt like pity mixed with fear. Every walk to the mailbox like stepping onto a stage. Jake and Maria's life had become a slow-moving nightmare, and though they clung to hope that reason would prevail, deep down they sensed it. The conflict was no longer about rules or community standards. It was personal, it was targeted, and it was heading toward a breaking point they could not yet see. Each day pushed them closer to the edge, and somewhere just beyond that edge was an act that would change everything forever. The day of the breaking point began with a heavy stillness that hung in the air. Jake had risen early, hoping to mow the lawn and take care of the chores. Before the heat set in, Maria brewed coffee in the kitchen while the children played with their toys. In the living room, for a brief moment, life felt normal again. Then the sound of footsteps crunched across the gravel driveway, and the figure they dreaded appeared. Karen stood at the edge of their property, phone in hand, already recording, her voice sharp as she called out about yet another violation, this time claiming their trash bins had been left out too long. Jake clenched his jaw. He had brought them in hours earlier. It was nothing but another lie, another provocation. He tried to ignore her, focusing on his work. But Karen stepped further onto the driveway, her voice rising. She accused him of endangering the neighborhood, of lowering property values, of being irresponsible. Her words echoed with the confidence of someone who believed she could never be challenged. Maria appeared in the doorway, her face pale. The children huddled behind her legs. Neighbors began to drift out of their homes, drawn by the noise. Windows slid open, curtains shifted, all eyes turning toward Jake's house as the scene unfolded in broad daylight. The argument escalated. Jake raised his voice for the first time, demanding that she leave his property. His hands trembled from weeks of bottled anger and fear. Karen smirked, pulling a folded paper from her bag and waving it like a weapon. It was another notice, a foreclosure threat stamped with the HOA's seal. She thrust it toward him, declaring loudly that his home would soon belong to someone who respected the rules. Jake felt his chest tighten. Maria's cry broke through the chaos. The humiliation of being mocked and threatened on his own front lawn seared into his mind. And then the moment that no one could have predicted arrived. Karen's hand went to her purse, pulling out a small handgun. The sight of the weapon froze the entire street. Maria screamed, neighbors gasped, children ran back inside their homes. Time seemed to slow as the reality of what was happening sank in. Karen leveled the gun at Jake, her voice shrill with rage. She accused him of threatening her, of making her feel unsafe, twisting the truth even as she took control of the moment. Jake's heart pounded. His instincts told him to protect his family, but he stood frozen, unwilling to provoke her further. The gun fired, the crack echoing through the neighborhood like thunder. Jake staggered back, a sharp pain ripping through him as he collapsed onto the grass. Maria's scream pierced the silence. She rushed forward, dropping to her knees, blood staining her hands as she tried desperately to hold her husband. Neighbors cried out in shock. Some ducked behind cars. Others fumbled for their phones. But no one dared step closer. The street had become a stage for violence born from obsession and unchecked power. And Karen stood at the center of it, her face twisted with a sick sense of triumph. But the chaos did not last long. Within minutes, the sound of sirens filled the air, red and blue lights flashing as police cars screeched to a halt. Officers spilled out, weapons drawn, commanding Karen to drop the gun. She hesitated, looking around as if realizing for the first time that her performance had an audience. Her defiance faltered as the weight of what she had done settled in. The gun clattered to the ground. Officers swarmed her, pushing her against the hood of a cruiser, handcuffs snapping tight around her wrists. The image of her once untouchable presence, reduced to a criminal, was burned into the minds of everyone watching. Maria held Jake close, her hands shaking, begging him to stay with her. The paramedics arrived, rushing to stop the bleeding. Neighbors who had once stayed silent now whispered in shock, their fear of Karen shattered by the reality of her violence. The community that had been paralyzed by her control was suddenly wide awake, watching the downfall of the woman who had ruled over them for so long. Jake's life hung in the balance as he was lifted onto a stretcher. Maria followed close behind, her face streaked with tears, but her eyes burning with a new fire. The fire of someone who had seen the worst and refused to be broken. For the first time, Karen had no clipboard, no letters, no board members nodding at her words. She was simply a woman in handcuffs, surrounded by flashing lights, her voice silenced by the reality of her crime. The neighbors who had once avoided her gaze now stared openly, their fear replaced with anger, with relief, with the recognition that they had all been complicit in her reign of intimidation by staying quiet. The image of her being driven away in the back of a police car became the moment the neighborhood would never forget. Yet as the sirens faded and the street fell into uneasy silence, one question lingered in the air, a question that would haunt everyone who had witnessed it. How had a homeowners association, created to protect and preserve peace, become the setting for such violence? And what would happen to the community now that the mask of order had been ripped away? The story was not over. It was only shifting into its final chapter, where the true impact of what had happened would be felt in every home on that street. The days after the shooting passed in a blur of hospital rooms and whispered conversations. Jake survived, though the bullet had left him weak and fighting through waves of pain. Maria never left his side, sleeping in a chair by his bed, her hand always resting on his arm, as if afraid that letting go might mean losing him. The doctors told her it would be a long road to recovery, but he was alive, and that fact alone gave her the strength to keep moving forward. The children visited in short bursts, too young to fully grasp what had happened, yet old enough to sense that their world had been shaken. Back in the neighborhood, the shock lingered like a heavy fog. For years, residents had lived under the shadow of Karen's authority, bending quietly to her demands, avoiding her gaze, allowing her to dictate the rules of their lives. Now she was gone, removed not by a vote or a meeting, but in handcuffs. The story spread quickly. Reporters parked on the corner, cameras capturing the quiet rows of houses that hid such violence. Neighbors were interviewed, their voices shaky as they admitted they had feared her, that they had seen the signs of obsession and control, but had stayed silent. The collective guilt was impossible to ignore. The Homeowners Association scrambled to distance itself. Emergency meetings were called, board members resigned, and the community bylaws were suddenly under review. But the damage was already done. The mask of order had been ripped away to reveal the ugly truth of unchecked power. Some spoke of dissolving the HOA entirely. Others argued for reform. Yet everyone agreed that things could never go back to the way they had been. The memory of Karen on the front lawn with a gun had changed them forever. For Jake and Maria, the struggle continued in quieter ways. Stacks of legal paperwork followed them home from the hospital. Lawyers reached out offering help. Investigators pieced together the months of harassment leading to the shooting. Maria provided the thick folder of documents and photographs. They had carefully collected every violation notice, every inflated fine, every threat, laid bare for the world to see. The evidence painted a clear picture, not of a fair and balanced association, but of a personal vendetta fueled by obsession. Karen's downfall was no longer just a story of violence. It was a case study in abuse of power. The trial drew even more attention. The courtroom filled with neighbors who once whispered in private, now willing to speak aloud. They testified to her harassment, to the fear she spread, to the way the board turned a blind eye. Karen sat at the defendant's table. No clipboard, no authority, only the cold reality of shackles and charges she could not escape. Maria took the stand, her voice steady as she recounted the months of torment, the endless notices, the threats, and finally the day her husband nearly died. The jury listened in silence, the weight of her words impossible to ignore. When the verdict came, it was decisive. Karen was found guilty, her sentence sealing her fate. She would no longer walk the streets with false authority, no longer weaponize rules against her neighbors, no longer terrorize families in the name of property values. For the community it was closure. For Jake and Maria it was vindication. Though the scars remained, though nightmares still haunted their sleep, they knew justice had been served, and with it came a fragile sense of peace. In the months that followed, change rippled through the neighborhood. The HOA shrank in power, its rules softened, its leadership replaced by those who truly sought to serve rather than control. Neighbors who had once avoided each other began to connect. Bonds formed over shared guilt and shared survival. Barbecues returned. Children played without fear of being photographed or fined. Slowly, the sense of community that had been stolen was rebuilt, fragile but genuine, born from the recognition that silence in the face of abuse had nearly cost them all much more. Jake's recovery was long but steady, each step forward celebrated, each day at home a reminder of what had been nearly lost. Maria carried her own scars, the memory of blood on her hands and sirens in the distance replaying at night. Yet she too found strength in speaking out. Her story reached beyond the neighborhood. Interviews, articles, and online forums shared their experience, sparking conversations about HOAs across the country, about the dangers of unchecked authority, about the thin line between order and tyranny. The story became more than one family's nightmare. It became a warning, a reminder that power without accountability can twist even the most ordinary setting into a battlefield, that the pursuit of control can blind a person until they destroy not only others but themselves. Neighbors who had once dismissed their struggles now admitted their own, sharing tales of harassment, fines, and manipulation. The collective voices joined into something larger, something louder, a push for reform in communities far beyond their own. Yet for Jake and Maria, the greatest impact was personal. Their bond deepened, tested by fire and tempered by survival. They no longer took quiet evenings on the porch for granted. Every moment together felt precious, every laugh from their children a gift. The house they had nearly lost became more than just walls and a roof. It became a symbol of resilience, a reminder that even when faced with cruelty and violence, they had endured. They had fought, and they had won. Still the question lingered, whispered in late-night conversations and debated at town meetings. How had it gone so far? How had petty disputes about grass height and paint, colours spiraled into gunfire on a suburban lawn? The answer was not simple. It lay in fear, in silence, in the willingness of good people to look away until it was too late. And though justice had been served, the lesson could not be forgotten. The community carried it forward, vowing never again to allow one voice to dominate unchecked. As the seasons changed and life found its rhythm again, the memory of that day faded into story, retold at gatherings, whispered to newcomers, passed down as a cautionary tale. The children who had once hidden in fear grew older, carrying only fragments of memory. Yet for Jake and Maria, it would never fully fade. It was etched into them, into the way Maria glanced at the mailbox with cautious eyes, into the way Jake stood taller when he saw his neighbors, into the way their family moved forward stronger, wiser and unbroken. And in the quiet of the evenings, when the sun sank behind the rooftops and the sky turned gold, Jake and Maria often sat together on the porch, the same place where so much had begun, the weight of the past still there, but lighter now, replaced with gratitude, with strength, with the simple joy of being together. The neighborhood around them seemed calmer, softer, healed in its own way, but the story remained, a permanent reminder that beneath the surface of even the most perfect communities, darkness can fester if left unchecked. So when the final chapter of their ordeal was closed, when Karen's name became nothing more than a bitter memory, and the HOA reformed into something closer to what it was meant to be, the takeaway was clear. Silence feeds power. Fear allows it to grow, but courage, even when it comes at great cost, can shatter it. And though the scars will never fully fade, neither will the strength gained from surviving. Their story was no longer just about survival. It was about the unshakable truth that no one should ever feel unsafe in their own home. And the question that lingers for anyone who hears it is simple. If faced with the same abuse of power, would you have the courage to stand and fight? Or would you look away until it was too late?